Hey friends, welcome to our weekly Data Talk, a show where we talk with data science leaders from around the world. Super excited today to talk to Greg Satell. He's a best-selling author, innovation advisor, contributor to Harvard Business Review and Inc., and the author of a brand new book called Cascades: How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. Greg, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Great to be here.
Greg, so you're a recognized expert in innovation. I've seen you speak at conferences. You're all over the place. You're writing all over the place.
I do keep busy.
You are very, very busy and writing all these case studies. And I always love reading your articles. And I'm kind of curious about kind of your background, how you got started and started tracking companies that were being very innovative and having the leadership that could drive innovation.
Sure. It really, I spent most of my career running companies as an executive and an entrepreneur. And I wanted to learn how to solve problems better. You come up against various issues when you're running a business, and you want to go see who else had similar problems, how they solved them, who did them well, who failed, why they failed, how you can apply other people's experiences to problems you need to solve. So it was always a very practical type of activity where I was just looking how to. There's no owner's manual for running a business. So I always was looking far and wide for anything that could help me get an edge to compete.
Well, it's cool because, you go far beyond that. You're basically an academic. You're like drilling into what leaders are doing and kind of creating a how-to book.
Right. I don't consider myself an academic. I consider myself very thorough.
There you go.
Some might even say anal, but I do think that it's important to be rigorous, and especially as an entrepreneur, when you're leading a company, any mistake you make affects, hundreds or sometimes thousands of people. And I always took that responsibility very, very seriously. So at the same time, you can't let it paralyze you. You have to make decisions. But you want those decisions to be as informed as possible, so that when you're, when you're in the moment, you can make them quickly and you can make them with some sort of confidence. And after you make them, you can monitor them and understand as quickly as possible when you've made the wrong decision, so that you can jump in and make another decision. Hopefully that will be a better one. If not, you just have to keep iterating and moving forward. But you can close that loop by really being rigorous and not jumping on the next fad, but really looking for evidence-based practices and asking hard questions of others and yourself.
I feel like when you talk about the bandwagon, there's a lot of buzzwords that are out there. Things like change agent, and these are all true terms. They're the right terms. Being data driven, like that's a buzzword now, but it's like essential to being a good leader, to driving innovation, is you got to be data driven. But I feel like sometimes those buzzwords are kind of abused. Would you say that's true?
I think it's interesting that one of the buzzwords that's become so popular over the last 10 or 20 years is paradigm shift. And what paradigm shift originally meant, with Thomas Kuhn, who came up with the idea, what he was really trying to figure out was how you do revolutionary science. And what he found was people find something that works, and it's good enough, it solves a lot of problems, and people stop questioning it. And once people stop questioning it, others start noticing. A new generation comes along, and they notice that, maybe it doesn't fit in every case, and there's certain anomalies. And at first, those are sort of explained away. And after a while, they become just too many anomalies to simply explain away. And that's when revolutionary science takes place. You can think of somebody like Einstein. There was just too many problems people were noticing with Newtonian mechanics, and an entirely new science needed to be created. I think it's the same with buzzwords. People find something that works, and they try and overgeneralize it, right? So people will see a company or somebody do amazing things with data, and all of a sudden want to apply that to everything. And you get these sometimes very data-driven approaches to things like managing performance. And there's a fantastic book called Weapons of Math Destruction.
Oh, yeah.
About how that can go awry. So, buzzwords are fine. They are, they're always based on something real. But I think just because something's become popular and everybody's talking about it doesn't mean you can just shut off your skepticism. And that's what I mean about being rigorous. You always need to ask the hard questions, especially of received wisdom. And just a bit of personal experience. I first, most of my adult life, I lived overseas in developing countries in Eastern Europe. And that was a fantastic experience because I came, the first country I lived in was Poland, which was just in its early post-communist period. And I was coming as the American who understood how, private enterprise is supposed to work. And I was telling people, well, you have to do things this way. And they would ask me why. And then I'd have to think about it. And after a while, I started to realize that certain things were just by convention and certain things actually had reasons. But I was amazed how many things I'd been taught to believe about business in general and specifically about our industry. So many of them were simply just conventions and could be done a completely different way. And as I started to do business in many different countries, I began to find that often the same basic industry, the same basic business could be run in almost unlimited different ways. And so that was a real eye-opener for me. And I guess that's sort of what drives me to always look further and check more facts and see, what could be different than the received wisdom would have us believe.
How do you think that changed you as an innovator and as a leader, going from the U.S., going to Poland, and just being overseas and seeing how corporations were being built up, and then as you were leading and causing change there, and the questions you're getting, how would you say that shaped you as a leader?
I think it just basically opened up my imagination and allowed me to. I remember when I came back to the United States, I was amazed, and I think it's a real problem in the United States where people can spend an entire career in one narrow function within one industry, and they have a certain worldview, and when it changes, they're not really aware of different worldviews. If you look at what happened in the media industry, for example, where people like newspapers, they had a very specific idea of how a newspaper should work, very specific idea about what makes television programming successful. But selling electronic media is completely different than selling advertising in print media. So they had to completely rethink the logic of their business. If you look at what's happened to content, to programming in the age of Netflix, when everything's being programmed for binge watching rather than somebody flipping channels. So
That's
rather
right.
than having to wrap up everything in a neat bow at the end of the episode, the way it was in back in the 70s or something. Now, when you look at a popular show, they tend to have multiple storylines weaving in and out. There's much, much more focus put on things like long-term character development, things that you couldn't do in a broadcast environment, but are necessary to be successful in a binge watching environment. So I think those 15 years I spent overseas working in multiple different countries and seeing that there's almost no limit to the way you can run a business. It was incredibly valuable. And of course, my new book, Cascades, is very, very much based in my experiences in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had here at Experian, we have a bi-monthly webinar where we talk with different leaders from around the globe, and we just featured Genevieve Juilliard, and she worked here in the U.S. and then she was over in Australia, and then she was working in Africa, and she was talking about to your point about the benefit of working in different parts of the world, how it gives you a different perspective. She said what was interesting, and she's a change agent. She is doing phenomenal things here at Experian. She talked about going to Africa and her style of leadership. She likes to, at least when she was here in the U.S., when she would work with people, she would like to ask them questions. She's like a coach, right? So you come with her with a question or a problem, and she could definitely give you her perspective to help you solve the problem, but she likes to coach you along. Like she'll ask you questions to kind of help you think about the problem and come up with your own solution. And that's a very motivational, kind of encouraging way for someone to kind of own an issue. And she talked about when she went over to Africa and began to use that same methodology to help manage people, that style of leadership wasn't working. She found that by asking them questions, so someone would come to her with a challenge, and she would begin her process to go, okay, how should we solve this? And she'd start to ask very smart questions. Well, in Africa, the way it was received was people felt like, well, she doesn't know what she's doing. She's asking me. And so she had to then realize that to be innovative, to be a change agent, and to manage people in different countries, it's going to differ based on their perceptions of how leaders work. And I thought that was really kind of interesting. And so, Greg, your perspective is fascinating, being in Poland.
Well, it's true. For instance, in many countries in Eastern Europe, it's a much more personal style of business. So a conversation that would be deemed very inappropriate in the United States would be seen as very much as part of the trust building. But I think in any environment, international or otherwise, I think as a manager and a leader, you have to look at it as your role to help others achieve help them actualize whatever potential they have. And everybody comes to you with something, and everybody needs something. So as a leader, you need to learn first how to leverage what they're bringing you, but even more importantly, how to give them what they need. So certain employees, certain people really like, someone to just bounce ideas off. Other people want to be inspired. Other people simply want to be left alone to do their job.
That's true.
So and I think you have to be just as rigorous with your people as you do with data. That you can't. Everybody is everybody brings their own set of experiences, abilities, insecurities, what have you. And there's no one size fits all approach. And I strongly believe that being a strong leader is going and being very serious about making sure you're providing everybody, whether they're an employee, a partner, or a customer, everything that you can to help them succeed. And it's just so important to see people as ends in themselves rather than as a means to an end. And people really see the difference. If they feel that you are interested in them as an end in themselves, not simply as a means to sell a product or to get promoted or something, that's how you build bonds of trust, and that's how you get a good team dynamic working.
I'm curious, as you speak around the world and as you are talking with leaders, during this time where companies are trying to be innovative, they're trying to be rigorous, to your point. I'm curious about some of the challenges that they come to you with, as they take you aside and say, Greg, I want to talk to you about something. What are some of the challenges you're noticing leaders are having today?
So a huge challenge is that people see innovation around products. And the idea is that if you come up with a solution, your job is done. And one of the things I talked about in mapping innovation, how innovation is really a process with three parts: discovery, engineering, and then transformation. And everybody underestimates the transformational part. Mm-hmm. They think if you come up with a great product, everybody will want to adopt it. But that's rarely true. Mm-hmm. It's especially if something is completely new and different, which is why I wrote Cascades, to help people take an idea and spread it and drive transformation.
When you were saying that, Greg, I was thinking about the Google glasses that came out, was it 5 years ago? And that was something that very innovative, very creative, like so much possibility. But
it was a bad product market fit. Now Google Glass is actually doing quite well. One of the things I like to say a lot is, in a regular business, that you always want to be looking for the largest addressable market. But if you're doing something different, really truly different, you always want to look for the hair on fire use case, not the broadest application, but somebody who needs a problem solved so badly that they're willing to overlook glitches. Nobody badly needed to walk around on the street for Google Glass, but what they're finding is, in an industrial environment, it solves lots of problems that people really need to solve. How do you how do you get access to an instruction manual while you're working on fixing something? Or how do you learn a new process quickly?
That's right.
So that's a much different type of thing. And that's really how the transformation process starts, is when you find that hair on fire use case. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, people say, I want to drive this transformation, but how do I convince people that it's the right one? And what I tell them is, as soon as you find yourself feeling like you have to convince somebody, you're on the wrong track. You either have the wrong problem or the wrong people. Anybody who's ever been married or had kids knows how difficult it can be to solve. It's how difficult it can be to convince even one person. So if you expect to convince dozens or hundreds or thousands of people, that's a pretty high bar. So and so often we see, we talk about change as either top down or bottom up. But a true transformation is always side to side. So what you can control is is who you start with. So instead of going out and trying to convince a lot of people, go and find people who are already enthusiastic about the change you seek to make in the world, and empower them to bring in others who are maybe slightly less enthusiastic, and those can bring in others still, and that's how you build a cascade. It's funny. I was talking to Barry Levinson about this with Experian's efforts to shift to the cloud, and I included it in my book because what he did fits so well. He saw, for instance, that there was a huge opportunity in cloud technology because customers were saying they wanted real-time access to data, and he saw a cloud architecture is the only way he could really provide that. But instead of running around trying to convince everybody, oh, we need to shift to the cloud, he started with empowering and training a small cadre of apostles who could then go and trade others. He also didn't race just to go and build out a cloud architecture with public-facing APIs. He started with what I call in my book a keystone change. And that's a change that is a clear and tangible goal. It involves multiple stakeholders that you'll need for the larger vision, and it paves the way for future change. So what Barry did, he said, let's not jump to the cloud all at once. Let's start by building some internal APIs. Mm-hmm. So it's so there's not much risk. We're only sharing data internally. But when individual managers within Experian saw the benefit that they could get from just internal APIs, that helped build momentum for the larger vision. And that's very much how a cascade forms and drives transformation.
I love how you put it. Transformation is side to side, because you're right. A lot of times we do hear about it top down. That's usually the way that I hear it. It's got to come top down,
or bottom up.
Or bottom up.
But bottom up's a real problem too, because if you haven't done the work to build a shared purpose in your culture, pushing decisions down is just an invitation for chaos. It's much easier for people to get people to do what you want if they already want what you want. If they share your purpose, then driving decision making down is possible. But you can't just wake up one day. It's you have to do the hard work of building a culture of trust and shared purpose.
I'm curious, are there other companies that you look at that you think are doing a really good job? Because I know your book is packed with case studies, and just curious, other companies outside Experian that you think are just doing a killer job
of transformation. Certainly, some of the problem with finding a current company is these things tend not to be documented until they're over, which is one of the reasons why I focused in my book so much on social and political movements, as well as things like transformations that are a bit older, IBM in the 90s, Alcoa. But we have these three sort of buckets that are kept completely separate. The one is political activism, one is social activism, and one is corporate transformation or organizational transformation. And what I began to find in my research was that in political and social transformations, those very same principles apply very, very well to corporate transformations.
That's so
But they've
fascinating.
been around some of these for decades. The other real advantage is we tend to find out about business transformation some years later when a business professor or consultant decides to write a case study, and they go back and do some interviews, and that's helpful to a certain extent. When you look at social and political movements, though, we often have thousands upon thousands of contemporary firsthand accounts and incredible documentation of what happened. So when I talk to executives at IBM from that period, or when I talked to Barry, and I said, "Well, did you notice this? Did this happen?" He said, "Oh yeah, now that you mentioned it, it did." And no idea that that particular thing was an almost universal principle. So let's look at the earlier example I gave with Barry and Leibniz and Experian and the APIs and that keystone change. The example I give in the book, the main example for that was actually Gandhi and India. When he was asked to design a program of civil disobedience in 1929, he knew that was a really tough problem because he'd tried it 10 years before and failed miserably. It led to an absolute terrible massacre. So he knew he had to be very much like Barry. He knew he had to be very, very careful of what he would do. He knew that he couldn't get people too riled up because it would lead to riots. And at the same time, he had to find an issue that would unify all Indians. So what he came up with was salt. He was going to march against the salt laws. And nobody thought it was a good idea. Everybody thought it must be some kind of a joke. Here we want liberty, we want independence. You're talking about salt. But what Gandhi saw was that for most Indians, they didn't care whether they were ruled by Indian elites or British elites. But salt was something that mattered to everybody. And even in England, many people found the salt laws fundamentally unjust. So when he set out with only about 70 or 80 of his closest followers to march to the sea to manufacture salt, it was later said that it was like a spring had been released. And today, the Salt March is known as Gandhi's greatest triumph because it was a keystone change. It showed that the British Raj could be defied in a very similar way. And every single transformation I looked at, whether it was something like Gandhi or the Civil Rights Movement, or whether it was a corporate transformation at Experian or IBM, or in a social movement like the LGBT movement, or something called 100K in 10, a movement to improve STEM education in America that's going on right now. They all had this particular attribute. So, and that was true with many of the principles. So I think whenever you're able to take something that's truly been battle tested over the years, I mean, in many cases, literally battle tested, and apply it to your business, I always think that's a great thing.
What a great example. And Greg, by the way, I love that you're pulling from social political transformations. Like, you saw that and are like, this is just like corporate transformations. I love that you did that. There's
kind of a backstory to that, because in 2004, I found myself in Kiev, Ukraine, and I was running this major news organization. I was running a media company, but one of our divisions was a major news organization. And it was the middle of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And I was just amazed how thousands upon thousands of people who'd ordinarily be doing thousands upon thousands of different things all of a sudden stopped whatever it was they were doing and started to do the same thing all together in unison.
Oh, wow.
In ways that were large and small. And I described this in the book, and being, on the one hand, amazed and completely confused. You know, we hear about viral activity, things going viral online, but you know, to be in the middle of an entire country going viral was really quite something. But also, I was running a significant enterprise at the time, and I thought to myself, you know, I'd like to be able to do that, because I've got these, you know, thousands upon thousands of different customers buying thousands upon thousands of different things. I want them to unify on the one thing that I'm trying to sell them. I'd like to know how to do that. And here I have these hundreds of employees, all with their own ideas. And I'd like them to unify on the initiatives that I feel are important. And the same thing with our investors and our advertisers. So that's what set me out on this 15-year journey that led to Cascades. And a few years later, I was in Silicon Valley, and everybody was talking about social networks. So I thought, you know, we had a major digital division. I thought that's something I should probably learn about. So I started reading up on network theory, and what I found was a mathematical explanation for everything that happened during the Orange Revolution that confused me. And I found that there was scientific principles behind all these things.
Wow.
Very sound mathematical models. And so that's what got me hooked.
Interesting.
And so I started researching how this happens in politics or social, and trying to figure out how it happens within companies. And I kept at it for 15 years. I also, along the way, got to know somebody named Srdja Popovic. Now, Srdja was one of the leaders of the movement that overthrew Milosevic in Serbia. And then I had known of him because he and his colleagues trained the activists in Ukraine and Georgia before that. And then they made this, they created this organization called Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. And since then, they've been active in over 50 countries, training activists, everywhere from Egypt, Zimbabwe, and Burma. And we struck a friendship together. And
how cool!
I've spent some years now talking with Srdja and going through his principles, because they have very, very clear action plans. And so it was wonderful to take these tools that have, again, literally been battle tested. Some of them have been around for decades, and then apply them to business transformation. So it's been just a wonderful, wonderful journey. And to be honest, I've been just amazed how well everything fits together.
That is so cool. I got to say, Greg, that in itself is innovative, right? Taking these things happening in the social political world, finding these key attributes for what created change and saying, yes, like those things fit perfectly to how we create change in business.
Right. I mean, I think we put too much emphasis on ideas. Innovation is really about solving problems. If you find a good problem, the ideas will come. And I think that innovation really happens is when you find a problem that's meaningful to you and you want to solve it. And that's basically what happened to me with Cascades. I was in the middle of this amazing thing, and I was completely confused about, and everybody was. I think one of the sort of worst business myths is that really, really smart people are in the middle of all this confusion, and they somehow put all the pieces and figure it all out in an instant. Nothing is achieved that way. You, in my study of innovation, even with geniuses, people like Jim Allison, who just won the Nobel Prize last fall, they all started with something that they were really, really confused about. And when you're able to clear that up for a problem that is important, you can achieve great things.
Greg, what advice do you have for the individual at a company, and they're listening to you, and they're like, they see some issues, some ways that the business could better serve their clients, but they're wondering, okay, how do I begin to kind of find those people in the organization that I can begin to partner up with, because this has got to be a team. It's got to be a team effort to make this happen. Here at Experian, we have these chatter groups and Slack groups where we can any employee, we can just create a group and begin to find people in the organization, begin to discuss things.
I don't really believe in those online groups.
Oh, you don't like them? Okay.
I think they're very strong for an existing collaboration. They're very strong for enabling. But a collaboration is a personal relationship, and those things need to be made personally. So I think some of the things that you guys do at Experian, like the employee resource groups, or the what do you call it, the tour?
The tour day Experian. Yes.
Right. Those types of ongoing bonds really help. Build what's called boundary spanners. There's a network theory term.
Oh, I never heard of that.
Yeah, those are people. Those are links that are random with respect to the network. So you can imagine if your best friend from college works in another department or another division at Experian, that connection wouldn't seem at all random to you. But with respect to the organization, that means that everybody he works with and everybody you work with are connected.
Oh, hold on, Greg. You just got blocked. Hold on one second. Oh, there we go, Greg. You're back on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I'll so that if your best friend from college works in a completely different division, that means everybody you work with and everybody he's works with are connected through just one relationship, which is you. And that really helps knowledge and expertise circulate. I think if you see a problem that you feel is important, and you can't find anybody else who feels it's important, then you really need to start researching why. But I think in most cases, if it truly is a problem, you can go find collaborators. But again, back to what I said earlier, if you feel yourself needing to convince people, you need to either go find different people or a different problem.
That's really good advice. For those listening to the podcast, Greg Satell has a brand new book. Got to Google it. It's called Cascades: How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. You can go directly to Greg's website, which is gregsatell.com, GREGSATELL.com, to check out his book. Also, Mapping Innovations, his previous book. And also, Greg, can people follow you on LinkedIn to keep up with the articles you're writing?
Absolutely on LinkedIn or Twitter, and also on my blog, which is www.digitaltonto.com.
Okay, wonderful. Digitaltonto.com. Greg, you are like so big. You're always writing. It seems like every week I'm seeing some new article. I don't know how you're doing that.
Yeah, I post 2 new articles every week. So
How do you maintain that? I mean, because you do in-depth research and then you're writing. I don't know how you're able to keep all that up.
I don't write 2 articles a week because I have two things to write about every week. I find 2 things to write about every week because I set myself the standard of putting out 2 articles a week. So it's really that standard of writing 2 articles a week really forces me to go out and stretch and find things that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Well, I love your writing, and I think people should know also that it's not like you're just producing a blog post. You are actually doing research because you're always sharing quotes. You can tell the time you've spent developing these case studies. You put a lot of work into them, and they're super, super helpful. And obviously, leaders love them. I mean, I love reading your stuff on HBR. So thank you so much for all the contributions you've been making to help leaders innovate and do a better job. Everyone, please check out Cascades. Again, gregsatell.com. Greg, thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike.